Imagine a world where Tokyo, instead of being known for its iconic skyscrapers, is renowned for its sprawling metropolis over the water. A marvel of modern architecture, defying gravity and convention. Sounds like a scene from a sci-fi movie, right? Well, it's not. After World War II, this was the audacious idea presented by the celebrated Japanese architect Kenzo Tange to tackle the pressing issues of housing shortage and rapid urbanization. This plan, audacious and innovative, almost became a reality, forever changing the landscape of one of the world's most populous cities. But why was such a radical plan proposed, and what were the forces that ultimately led to its abandonment? Join us as we explore the fascinating story behind the floating metropolis, a concept that dared to dream beyond the confines of traditional urban planning. In the aftermath of World War II, Japan faced monumental challenges. Cities were in ruins, and millions were grappling with displacement. Tokyo, once a bustling metropolis, was now a shadow of its former self. The Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 had already caused widespread devastation, leaving scars that ran deep. Then came the Second World War, which devastated the city further. By 1945, Tokyo had been largely reduced to rubble. Homes were burnt to the ground, infrastructure was decimated, and the city's inhabitants were left with nothing. Amidst this despair, hope flickered in the form of visionary ideas. One such idea was put forward by the eminent Japanese architect Kenzo Tange, who had already gained prominence for his work on the Hiroshima Peace Memorial. Tange, along with other influential figures, saw an opportunity to not just rebuild Tokyo, but to create a new urban landscape that could accommodate the swelling population and revitalize the city. Their gaze turned towards Tokyo Bay, a vast expanse of water that had so far remained relatively untouched. The bay, they believed, held the key to the city's future. The idea was to construct a floating city, an urban hub that would sit atop the bay, anchored on robust pillars that would rise majestically from the water. It was a radical concept, a departure from the conventional wisdom of the time, which dictated that cities should grow organically on solid ground. Proponents of this radical plan argued that the floating city would not only solve the pressing issue of housing shortage, but also open up new possibilities for urban living. The city, they envisioned, would consist of self-contained neighborhoods, each with its own distinct character. These neighborhoods would be linked together by a central spine that would serve as a transportation highway, connecting the different parts of the floating city. The spine would be more than just a transportation route. It would house schools, hospitals, shops, and other essential facilities, ensuring that residents had easy access to the services they needed. But what about the environment? Wouldn't such a large-scale project disrupt the delicate balance of the bay's ecosystem? The answer, according to the plan's proponents, was an emphatic no. The floating city was designed to be in harmony with its surroundings. Green belts and parks would be interspersed throughout the neighborhoods, providing residents with a connection to nature. Industrial areas would be cordoned off, minimizing any potential impact on the quality of life for those living in the floating city. In fact, the plan's proponents argued that the floating city would actually enhance the aesthetic appeal of the bay, turning what was essentially a vast body of stagnant water into a vibrant, pulsating urban center. However, for all its ambitious promises, the floating metropolis was not without its critics. Many argued that the plan was simply too audacious, that it was not feasible from an engineering or financial standpoint. The sheer scale of the project was daunting. It would require the reclamation of vast tracts of land from the bay to create the artificial islands that would support the floating city. And how would these islands be anchored to the seabed? The plan's supporters had some solutions for these concerns. They argued that the floating city could be anchored to the seabed using concrete pillars that would extend from the bottom of the bay to the surface. The pillars would be hollow, allowing ships and boats to pass through to the various neighborhoods. Furthermore, the floating city would be built in phases, starting with a central spine, which would serve as the backbone of the entire project. As the city grew, additional neighborhoods would be added, each one more ambitious and innovative than the last. Despite these reassurances, many remained skeptical. Could Tokyo really support such a radical experiment? Only time would tell. The floating metropolis plan was not an isolated idea, nor did it exist in a vacuum. It was part of a larger conversation happening around Tokyo at the time, a conversation that grappled with the city's rapid growth and the challenges of housing a swelling population. The idea of building a floating city might seem outlandish today, but in the context of post-war Japan, it was a bold and innovative idea. Japan was in the midst of an economic and population boom. People were migrating from the countryside to the city in search of better jobs and a higher standard of living. This influx of people put a strain on the city's resources, leading to overcrowding and a shortage of affordable housing. At the same time, Tokyo was still recovering from the devastation of the Second World War. Much of the city had been destroyed, and the economy was in sharp decline. Faced with these challenges, Japanese leaders began to explore new ways of thinking about urban planning. What if they could build upwards instead of outwards? What if they could use the limited land available to them in a more efficient way? The idea of building a floating city was born. While Taniguchi's proposal took center stage, other plans were also put forward. Some architects suggested creating a new international airport on the bay. Others envisioned a residential belt along the water. However, none of these plans were as comprehensive or as ambitious as Tang's floating metropolis. Tang's plan stood out not just because of its scale, but also because of its audacity. It challenged the very definition of what a city could be. It forced people to rethink the boundaries between land and water, between reality and imagination. But why Tokyo Bay? Why was this particular location chosen for such a radical project? The answer lies in the very nature of the bay itself. Tokyo Bay was an underutilized space. It had been largely ignored in the city's overall development plan. This made it an ideal candidate for a bold experiment, a place where the rules could be bent and the boundaries of possibility could be explored. Additionally, the bay's strategic location offered a unique opportunity for connectivity. The floating city would be easily accessible from the mainland, making it an attractive option for residents. Furthermore, the bay's natural barriers provided a sense of security. The floating city would be protected from the strong Pacific Ocean currents, making it a safer option compared to other potential locations. Despite its numerous advantages, the floating metropolis was never fully realized. There were many reasons for this. The plan was too expensive. It would have required a huge investment of public funds, which Japan did not have at the time. It was also too risky. The technology required to build and maintain a floating city did not exist yet, and there was no guarantee that the project would be successful. Perhaps most importantly, the plan was too radical. It challenged the status quo in a way that few were comfortable with. Building a floating city was not just an engineering challenge, it was also a social and political one. It would have required a complete rethinking of how cities are built and managed, and few were willing to take that leap of faith. Despite its ultimate failure, the floating metropolis remains an important part of Tokyo's history. It represents a moment when the city dared to dream big, when it looked beyond the constraints of the present and imagined a future that was bold, innovative, and exciting. Even though the floating city was never built, its legacy lives on in the city's skyline. Today, Tokyo is known for its iconic skyscrapers and high-tech infrastructure. And while these structures are impressive, it's important to remember that they were made possible by the ideas of the past. The floating metropolis may never have been built, but its spirit lives on in the city's DNA. Today, we look back at the floating metropolis not just as a fascinating piece of history, but as a reminder of what is possible. With climate change and rising sea levels becoming an increasingly pressing concern, the idea of building on water is more relevant than ever. The floating metropolis may have been ahead of its time, but it planted the seeds for future innovations. Who knows? Maybe one day its audacious dream will become a reality. The floating metropolis is not just a story about a city's physical form. It's a story about its people, its dreams, and its aspirations. It's a story about a community coming together to rebuild after a devastating war, to create a new future from the ashes of the old. It's a story about the power of human ingenuity and the limitless possibilities of the human imagination. It's a story that inspires us to push the boundaries of what is possible and to never give up on our dreams, no matter how audacious they may seem. So let us raise a toast to the floating metropolis. May its spirit live on in the hearts and minds of all who dare to dream of a better future.